I'm back. The source, the book, the title, The Source, was James Michener's, I believe, first novel. And at the tell, where the stories all take place in this book, in its early history, the characters worship fertility gods and goddesses, and one really fiery, mean war god, Malik. His story, that is Michener's story, endears us to a young couple and their 4-month-old baby, so sweet, so cute, beginning to babble words. And I remember the thudding of my own heart and the visceral shock to my body at the core of it, because of the crude, stark reality when they were forced to actually feed that tiny human being, the progeny of their love, whom they were attached to, the child of her womb, as they threw it down a chute into the mouth of the fire god, Malik, as a human sacrifice. What reading this story did for me was to make me realize not just how wrong the practice of blood sacrifice was, but also what a very tame religion we have, and how little commitment it actually requires of us. How high a cost does our faith in God exact from us? Just how large and demanding is this God of ours? Abraham and Sarah thought that we should sacrifice children. They lived among the Canaanites. Now, many pagan religions of the time required the sacrifice of children. Why should they be any different? They were products of their culture, and yet their sacrifice of children went far beyond the religious ceremony of sacrifice. These would seem almost humane in comparison to what Abraham and Sarah did to their children. A parent once went with the son into an unknown wilderness to face a dreadful ordeal. When the child was on the verge of death, God's messenger intervened and tragedy was averted. Who were the parent and the son? One answer, of course, is Abraham and Isaac, the more familiar story. But another answer, equally true, is Hagar and Ishmael. They were victims of Abram's and Sarah's willingness to sacrifice children too. Through these two stories, I've come to realize how totally different we are than these progenitors of our faith, Abraham and Sarah. The story goes something like this. Abraham is old and he has a very big problem. Sarah is very old too, and they have lived into their 90s childless. So with Sarah's permission, Abraham fathers a child through Sarah's maid, Hagar, a slave. Ishmael is born to Hagar. And Sarah, though she agreed to it at first, and maybe it was even her idea to begin with, she doesn't really like it now. But what could she do? She has no child to offer. And the maid, Hagar's son, is a young boy when, great news! Sarah, wonder of wonders, has a child, a boy. She names him Isaac because there is great laughter at his birth. Now there's a big problem because there could only be one heir, just one. And though the birth of a natural-born son to a legitimate first wife supersedes both the adoption of Eleazar, Abraham's servant. If you remember, he thought he would have to leave his money or his wealth to a servant, and a child by a concubine or servant. Well, the child Ishmael is technically the eldest, though born to a concubine, and probably has no right to inheritance. At least it's very questionable. Sarah, however, is not going to take the chance that of him horning in on any of Isaac's inheritance or his position with Abraham. When Sarah feels that Ishmael and his mother have mocked her and her Isaac, she demands that Abraham throw the two of them out of the tent. Not just out of the tent, but out of the caravan, out of the safety of the community, into the desert. And they move to their next place. And Hagar and Ishmael are alone in the desert. Abraham actually believed that God told him it was okay to do this. Alone in the desert, then, Hagar and her little boy quickly move toward death. Their water and their food go quickly. The child weeps because there is nothing to drink. And Hagar, in desperation, moves away from the boy so that she will not have to watch him die, can't bear to listen to him cry for water. She cries out loud to heaven. And wonder of wonders, God hears. It's like a miracle. An angel appears to point to the well. It's just right over there that God has provided, right there in the desert. And they live. Now, I took time to retell this story one more time because it's not all that familiar to many of us, and maybe even this is the first reading of it you've ever had as Mark read the scriptures today. And it's not all that familiar because if we stop to hear it and we think about what it all means, I don't know about you, but it's repulsive to me. I think it should be. Here's the attempt on the part of our heroes, Abraham and Sarah, to waste human lives. We have a family abandoned by the father. We have the worst kind of abuse and neglect. Abraham doesn't care at all for the maid that he has taken to his bed, and Sarah is contemptuous of both mother and child and would expose them to the elements and to death. If we look at that story closely, we can't help but be disgusted by these events, and maybe even the people involved in them who have the power and the privilege and the wealth, and they abuse it mightily. Hagar's story continues today. In Africa, there is tragedy as thousands, even millions, die from disease and starvation. And millions of children have become orphaned from wars, left alone to die. In Syria, refugees from abuse by a disastrous government are cast out into the desert, crying out to God for asylum. Millions of children die of malaria every year and all kinds of other diseases that we know are curable and preventable, but without vaccine, they're left in the wilderness to die. Even our own borders are collecting the children who run from abusive governments and factions, searching for water in the desert. Hagar's story is also the story of the 1,300 toddlers and young children killed, at least that many annually, by household weapons left unsecured and the child unsupervised. It's a story of young people who are put out on the street and trafficked for prostitution. It's a story of many Hagars who worry constantly and pray almost all day long for their teenage sons and daughters that they might not perish in the gangs or, worse, be pulled over by a police officer and taunted for 42 minutes, and when reaching the breaking point and fleeing, be shot in the back and kicked and stepped on to die in the street. It's the story of children of Abraham, dying all alone in a wilderness, fortunate if they still have even their mother to weep for them and to pray and to cry out for them. We seldom hear Hagar's and Ishmael's story, that is, the victim's account of the events, which when told reveals the flaws of our spiritual heroes and their idea of what the covenant with God was about. I guess we prefer not to be reminded of those flaws, or of our own flaws for that matter. Why do our blessings, which we haven't earned, which we don't deserve, become the wedge between us and others who are less privileged? It's painful for us to hear of our great-great-great-grandmother Sarah's murderous actions and our great-great-great-grandfather Abraham's cowardly compliance. As painful as it is for us to ponder also some of our nations, our own families' dealings with those whom we have supplanted. Our own nation's dealings with the first Native Americans of the continent, and white ancestors' past dealings with persons of color as slaves, and our own complicity in the holding of the knee to the neck of Black people in our nation today. And then the saga continues. Our heroes go on with their own child. He's about 8 years old, probably, maybe a little older. And Isaac is being taken on a long hike with his father. They're going to make a sacrifice. Only Isaac is the unwitting victim of that sacrifice. Gratefully again, God intervenes. God is still the God of the mistreated and the abused. And here, I believe, is the story that tells us that Yahweh, the God of Abraham and Sarah, is not like Canaanite gods. The story makes it clear that Yahweh does not ask for, does not require, does not want the brutal sacrifice of children of any race, color, or station in life. Perhaps this is the main point of this story. God is still the God of the mistreated and the abused, and does not want to participate in that abuse, does not want that kind of sacrifice. And yet it's still true that we continue to sacrifice the children. Now, I realize that no decent parent in this enlightened age would think of taking out a knife and putting it to their child's throat and laying the bleeding body on the altar in order to appease God. Hopefully we're past that. Only primitive peoples would still do those things. Is that true? But has there ever been a time when children did not die because of the beliefs and passions of their parents? Every time nations go to war, it happens. Their sons and daughters die for the beliefs and the passions of their parents. We regularly discard our innocence in sacrifices to much lesser gods than Yahweh. We sacrifice our kids to the gods of getting ahead, to the almighty dollar, to our jobs, to our want for consumer goods. We neglect them and leave them thirsting for our companionship and hungry for our attention and our love. Children in India and Pakistan and other places with unrestricted child labor. We sacrifice to the gods of cheap consumer goods for us. For us. Us white people neglect our nation's black and brown children too, while wallowing in the privilege that their sacrifice allows us. So maybe the question is not, Will we sacrifice the children? The question is, to which God? To which altar? On which altar will we sacrifice the children? In which desert will they be abandoned? When we bring our own children to church, to Sunday school, for baptism, is it just cute rituals to make us feel good? Or do we really hope that they will take this religion seriously? As we're laying their lives out on the altar for Christ, hoping that God will have their life, take their lives, use their lives. Usually we hope that God doesn't want their lives too badly. That they won't run off and do something that is self-sacrificing, give over their lives to living with the poor, or squander their time on volunteer building projects, or lose their college money by giving it to charities. We hope that God will intervene in our sacrifices of our children, and that they will be given back to us intact. That somehow, miraculously, a well will appear in their desert, and an angel will stave off harm that would come to them. God intervenes. God is the God of those deserted in the wilderness, the God of those on the fringes, the God of the mistreated and abused and neglected. Abraham and Sarah, when will you notice your faults? And let your mistakes teach us gentleness and compassion. I cannot advocate for the continuance of that kind of abuse and turn blind eyes and deaf ears to the sacrificing of children anymore. Even if God intervenes, it is wrong. In every community, countless Hagars despair of their lives. The eyes of Hagar settle upon her perishing child. Do we have the compassion and the strength to offer Hagar welcome, provision, shelter until she can resume her life? Do we have the courage to say no to the false gods who would ask for the lives of our children? Do we have the compassion and understanding and wisdom to say no to anything that threatens the lives of any children anywhere? May God always give us the wisdom to understand and the courage to stand up to any force of evil and violence. Defend those who are too weak to defend themselves. God, the God of those deserted and abused, sends an angel to intervene. And who is that angel? Where are you? Where am I in these stories? Are we the unwitting victims of the violence? Those who are expendable in our society? Certainly, we're not the ones who perpetrate the violence in the name of religion. Could we be the angels of mercy that intervene to stave the knife and quench the thirst? I believe that we are the Church of Christ who would be the intervener, the advocates, the holy interpreters of God's will to a world of those seen as expendable, as abandoned, as imprisoned, laid on the altar of sacrifice for the sake of possessions and wealth and power and privilege. God depends on us to be the messengers of a better way, a new way of living and loving and healing the world. Yes, and even saving the world. Who are we in this story? As followers of Christ, somehow I hope we have discerned the answer to that question. Amen.